No one agrees on the exact reason humanity decides it must gather itself into a single city. Some say it begins with climate instability cascading faster than adaptation can keep up. Others say it's orbital debris, or a fragile biosphere that can no longer afford billions of scattered footprints. In truth, the reason matters less than the realization itself. The old pattern, cities here, wilderness there, nations layered over geology like mismatched transparencies, no longer works. Survival now requires proximity, density, deliberate design. The proposal is not called a city at first. That word feels too small, too historical. Cities grew organically, chaotically, in response to trade routes and rivers and wars. This is something else entirely. This is a world enclosure, a single continuous urban organism designed to hold every living human. 8.3 billion people. Not temporarily, but indefinitely. A place meant not just to house humanity, but to stabilize it. The first question arrives immediately and brutally. Where could something like this even go? Not politically. Geography doesn't care about flags, but physically. The city must sit somewhere geologically quiet, far from major fault lines, away from rising seas, insulated from hurricanes, volcanism, and extreme temperature swings. It must have access to sunlight, stable bedrock, and enough surrounding space to manage waste, energy, and atmospheric exchange. The answer that keeps resurfacing, unsettling and elegant, is continental interior. Large portions of Central Asia, the Australian interior, and parts of the African plateau rise to the top of early simulations. These regions share certain traits: ancient, stable cratons of rock, low seismic activity, minimal risk of sea level rise, and vast expanses of sparsely populated land. The absence of people, once seen as a disadvantage, becomes the greatest asset. Nothing needs to be erased. But selecting a location is not about finding an empty map square. It's about designing a relationship between the city and the planet. The world city cannot sprawl outward like the megacities of the 21st century. It cannot consume endlessly. It must rise, fold inward, layer itself vertically like geological strata, but intelligently, with sunlight, airflow, and human psychology in mind. From the beginning, architects argue that the city cannot be flat. A single-level structure large enough to house 8.3 billion people would cover a catastrophic percentage of Earth's surface. That would defeat the entire purpose. Instead, the city must be thick, a vertical ecology measured not in floors, but in inhabited kilometers. Not skyscrapers clustered together, but a continuous three-dimensional terrain of living space. Early models imagine a city footprint roughly the size of a small country, but stacked upward and downward. Residential zones interwoven with food production. Transit arteries embedded like circulatory systems. Quiet spaces layered above industrial ones. The city becomes less like a skyline and more like a manufactured mountain range, sculpted with intent. Yet even at this stage, before the first foundation is poured, the most difficult problem is not engineering. It's human. Convincing billions of people, each with languages, histories, attachments to land, to abandon the scattered geography of civilization and agree to cohabitate inside a single designed structure is unprecedented. There is no historical analogy, not migration, not empire, not globalization. What makes it possible, at least in theory, is that the city is not framed as a loss, but as a preservation. The world city is presented as a way to give the planet back to itself, to allow oceans to calm, forests to reconnect, ecosystems to breathe without constant interruption. Humanity, for the first time, steps out of the landscape and becomes a contained presence within it. In this framing, the city is not a prison. It is a compromise, a pact between a species and the world that carried it this far. And once that pact is accepted, once the decision is made that humanity will build one place large enough to hold itself, the question shifts from whether it can be done to something far more unsettling. What kind of civilization would emerge when everyone lives inside the same walls? Once the idea of a single world city stops sounding impossible and starts sounding inevitable, the debate narrows to something deceptively simple. Where do you place the foundation of humanity itself? This is not a question of borders or ownership. No nation can host a city that contains all nations. The land must, in some quiet philosophical sense, belong to no one, and be stable enough to belong to everyone. Geologists are among the first voices elevated in this discussion. They speak less about beauty and more about time. The ideal location is not where humans have thrived historically, but where the Earth has remained unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Ancient continental cores, regions of exposed or shallow bedrock that have survived supercontinents breaking apart, become prime candidates. These places are boring in the best possible way. No earthquakes, no volcanoes, no dramatic tectonic tension waiting to release itself. Climate scientists add another layer. The city must avoid extremes not just now, but under projected conditions centuries into the future. Coastal zones are dismissed almost immediately. River deltas, floodplains, and monsoon corridors follow. What remains are interior plateaus and high deserts, regions once considered hostile to dense civilization precisely because they offered little on their own. In this new equation, that emptiness is a feature. The city will bring everything it needs with it. Gradually, one location begins to dominate serious models: a vast inland plateau with stable rock, low seismic risk, abundant solar exposure, and minimal ecological disruption, if developed carefully. It is not chosen because it is ideal for human comfort, but because it is ideal for human control. Every variable, temperature moderation, water cycling, air quality, will be engineered. The outside environment becomes something observed, not relied upon. This marks a profound shift in how humanity relates to geography. For most of history, cities adapted to their surroundings. Rivers dictated trade, climate shaped architecture, seasons defined labor. The world city reverses that logic. Geography becomes a platform, not a partner. The land is no longer something to live with, but something to build upon, quietly, respectfully, but decisively. Still, the planners understand that a city holding 8.3 billion people cannot be isolated like a sealed vault. It must exchange heat, air, and energy with the planet without destabilizing it. The chosen site must allow the city to breathe without interfering with major atmospheric or oceanic systems. Placing it far from coastlines reduces the risk of weather amplification. Elevation helps regulate temperature. Latitude matters too. Not too close to the poles, where seasonal darkness would strain human psychology, and not too close to the equator, where heat management becomes energy-intensive. As the location solidifies, an unspoken realization spreads through the planning rooms. This city will become the geographic reference point of the species. Maps will quietly reorient themselves around it. Time zones may eventually bend toward its rhythms. Migration, once defined by borders and opportunity, will become a one-way movement inward. Yet the land itself remains indifferent. It does not welcome or resist. It simply waits. Survey teams arrive first, not with flags, but with instruments. They drill deep into the crust, mapping stress lines and mineral density. Satellites begin constant monitoring. The ground is measured not just for strength, but for silence. Any hint of geological unrest is treated as unacceptable, This city cannot afford surprises. By the time construction plans are finalized, the site has ceased to be a place in the traditional sense. It is no longer a desert or a plateau or an interior. It has become the base layer of civilization, a foundation not just for buildings, but for the future arrangement of humanity itself. And with the ground chosen, the conversation shifts from where the city will stand to something far more ambitious and abstract. What shape should a civilization take when it knows it must last? The location is finalized not with applause, but with a long, sober silence. The world city will be built in Central Australia, anchored to the ancient rock of the Australian Craton, near the region surrounding Alice Springs. Not directly atop the town itself, but spread across the vast interior plateau that radiates outward for hundreds of kilometers, land defined less by landmarks than by endurance. This is one of the oldest continuous pieces of crust on Earth, geologically calm for hundreds of millions of years. No active fault systems, no volcanoes, no coastal exposure, no glacial instability. Just stone that has learned how to stay still. From an engineering perspective, it is almost unnervingly perfect. The bedrock sits close to the surface, reducing foundational uncertainty. Seismic risk models flatten into near insignificance. There are no major river systems to reroute, no dense forests to displace, no coastal ecosystems to drown in shadow. The region's ecological footprint is relatively light, and with careful perimeter buffering, much of the surrounding desert biome can remain intact or even recover once human activity elsewhere withdraws. Climate models, stretched centuries forward, show something else that matters deeply: predictability. Central Australia is dry but stable. Extreme weather events are comparatively rare. Heat is a known quantity, not a chaotic one. That makes it manageable. A city designed from the ground up can shade itself, circulate air vertically, and harvest solar energy at a scale no scattered civilization ever could. The very harshness that once limited settlement becomes an advantage when every environmental variable is engineered rather than endured. Politically, the choice is delicate but deliberate. Australia's interior is sparsely populated, reducing displacement. International agreements reclassify the site as a planetary commons, no longer sovereign territory in the traditional sense, but administered by a global civil framework. Borders quietly dissolve at the edge of the construction zone. The city is not Australian, though it sits on Australian ground. It belongs to humanity by necessity, not by conquest. Culturally, the symbolism is striking. For centuries, the centers of power were coastal, ports, trade hubs, naval choke points. The world city turns inward, away from oceans and empire routes, choosing instead the still heart of a continent. Civilization retreats from the edges of the world and gathers at its core. Construction planners note another advantage that feels almost philosophical: isolation. The remoteness of Central Australia creates a natural buffer during the centuries-long build process. The city can rise without immediately destabilizing global migration patterns. Early phases are industrial, logistical, and frankly unlivable. This is not a place people rush toward. It is a place prepared patiently, layer by layer, before humanity is invited inside. From orbit, the first signs are subtle. Survey grids etched faintly into red earth, linear access corridors extending like spokes from a hub that does not yet exist. Temporary worker habitats clustered far from the eventual core, designed to be dismantled and erased once their purpose is fulfilled. Even during construction, the city avoids permanence until permanence is necessary. There is also an unspoken resonance with time. Indigenous cultures have lived in this region for tens of thousands of years, maintaining continuity where other civilizations rose and fell. That history is not overwritten. It is acknowledged, studied, and, where possible, protected. Certain areas are declared inviolable, folded into the city's design as preserved voids, spaces where nothing is built and silence is maintained. When the location is announced publicly, reactions are mixed but restrained. No one cheers, no one mourns. The choice feels less like a decision and more like a recognition, an acceptance that if humanity must gather itself into one place, it should do so somewhere the earth has already demonstrated an ability to endure. With the ground chosen and the coordinates fixed, the project crosses a psychological threshold. This is no longer speculation, no longer modeling. The city now has a latitude and longitude. And that makes the next question unavoidable. How do you design a place meant to hold every kind of human life without turning it into a machine that forgets what living feels like? Once the location is fixed, the architects inherit a problem that no blueprint has ever faced before. This city cannot simply function. It must feel livable to every kind of human who will ever exist inside it. It must hold billions without collapsing into monotony, surveillance, or quiet despair. If the world city is designed like a machine, people will live like components. And that, everyone agrees, would fail within a generation. So the guiding principle emerges early and survives every revision. The city must behave like a landscape, not a building. Instead of districts defined by function, residential here, industrial there, the city is organized into layers of experience. Living spaces bleed into public space. Food production overlaps with neighborhoods. Quiet zones rise above dense ones, while transit and industry sink below. No one lives next to infrastructure. They live within it, often without seeing it. The city is not imagined as a single skyline, but as a continuous terrain of habitable forms. Broad plateaus support residential zones that feel like towns. Vertical cliffs house dense populations with shared light wells and gardens carved into their faces. Deep interior volumes hold manufacturing, logistics, and energy systems, sealed and insulated from daily life. From inside, most residents will never perceive the full scale of the city. They will know only their local topography. This is intentional. Planners understand that human psychology evolved for villages, not planetary enclosures. The city therefore limits how much of itself any one person can experience at once. Sightlines are broken, neighborhoods curve inward. Public spaces are scaled for thousands, not millions. The illusion of smallness becomes a form of emotional infrastructure. Sunlight becomes sacred. Every inhabited zone must receive natural or convincingly natural light at some point in the day. Massive heliostat systems and reflective shafts route sunlight deep into the city's interior, creating artificial dawns and dusks. Time is not abolished, it is curated. People still wake, work, gather, and rest in rhythms that feel ancient, even though the sun may be redirected by mirrors kilometers away. Housing itself avoids uniformity at all costs. Modular construction is unavoidable at this scale, but repetition is treated as a psychological hazard. Facades vary. Interior layouts shift subtly between zones. Materials change texture and color as one moves through the city. The goal is not luxury, but distinctiveness. People must feel that where they live is somewhere, not merely inside. Culturally, the city is designed to fracture itself intentionally. Languages cluster, traditions persist. Architecture absorbs regional influences brought by the people who settle there. No single aesthetic dominates for long. the world city becomes a mosaic of microcultures stacked vertically instead of spread horizontally. Difference is not smoothed out. It is compartmentalized and protected. Movement through the city is quiet and continuous. There are no traffic jams because there are no roads in the traditional sense. High-speed transit loops connect major zones, while slow pedestrian corridors dominate daily life. Walking is never eliminated. Designers insist that a city you cannot walk through becomes a place you merely occupy, not inhabit. Perhaps the most radical choice is what the city refuses to do. There are no monumental central plazas meant to represent humanity as a whole. No single tower, no symbolic core. The city rejects the idea of a center. Everyone lives somewhere specific, but no one lives at the heart of everything. Power, culture, and attention remain distributed by design. Because a city that contains all people cannot afford to convince them they are small. By the end of the design phase, the world city is no longer imagined as a megastructure, but as a stacked civilization, a place where density does not erase intimacy and scale does not erase identity. And once its shape is decided, another question becomes unavoidable, heavier than steel and slower than concrete. How long does it take to build a place that must not fail? The first honest answer to how long the world city will take to build is deeply uncomfortable. Longer than any government term, longer than any corporate plan, longer than most people alive when it begins will live to see it finished. This is not a project measured in years or even decades. It is measured in generations. Construction does not start with towers or neighborhoods. It starts with groundwork that is almost invisible. Years are spent stabilizing the site, sealing bedrock fractures, and embedding monitoring systems deep into the crust. The city's foundations are not slabs, but lattices, three-dimensional structural webs designed to distribute weight across kilometers. These early layers look less like architecture and more like geology being gently persuaded into new forms. Only once the ground itself is made trustworthy does vertical construction begin. And even then, the city does not rise uniformly. It grows in bands. One habitable layer at a time, each self-contained, each capable of supporting life before the next, is added above or below it. This staged approach is deliberate. If something goes wrong, failure must be local, not systemic. Automation carries much of the burden. Autonomous excavation systems carve vast interior volumes. Robotic assemblers lay structural members with tolerances tighter than human hands could manage. Materials are prefabricated off-site or off-world as orbital manufacturing slowly integrates, then lowered into place like pieces of an impossibly patient puzzle. Human labor is reserved for oversight, adaptation, and cultural detailing rather than brute construction. Early estimates suggest that reaching full capacity, housing, feeding, and sustaining 8.3 billion people will take 2 to 3 centuries, not because it cannot be done faster, but because rushing introduces fragility. Every decade of additional build time increases redundancy, resilience, and adaptability. The city is designed to change, but it must never collapse. During this long construction period, the city is never empty. Populations move in gradually, occupying completed layers while others remain skeletal or sealed. Life and construction coexist. Children are born inside unfinished corridors that will one day be deep infrastructure. Elderly residents remember when entire sections were still open sky. The city becomes a lived timeline, its growth embedded in memory rather than recorded only in archives. Sociologists note something unexpected during this phase. The act of building the city becomes a unifying culture in itself. People do not speak of moving to the city so much as growing into it. Each generation inherits a slightly more complete world than the last, and with it, a sense of stewardship. The city is not something given, it is something continued. Crucially, nothing is ever considered final. Materials are chosen for reversibility, walls can be reconfigured, entire neighborhoods can be reworked without destabilizing adjacent zones. The city is built with the assumption that future humans will think differently, live differently, and value things not yet imagined. There are moments, especially early on, when critics call the project a folly. Too slow, too expensive, too cautious. But the planners understand something history has taught repeatedly. Civilizations fail not because they aim too high, but because they build as if time will forgive mistakes. This city is built with the opposite assumption. By the time the uppermost inhabited layers begin to close in over the earliest foundations, centuries have passed. The outside world has changed dramatically. Much of the planet has been allowed to recover, emptying as people move inward. Forests reclaim old cities. Coastlines quiet. The earth slowly relearns what it was like to exist without constant human pressure. And inside the growing city, a new question begins to surface, less about construction and more about consequence. What does it mean to live your entire life inside a place that was designed before you were born and will continue long after you are gone? By the time the world city reaches a scale where billions reside within its layers, daily life has diverged so completely from historical norms that comparisons become useless. This is no longer urban living stretched to an extreme. It is an entirely new human condition, one defined not by expansion, but by containment. For most residents, the city is not experienced as a singular place. It is experienced as a neighborhood universe. People know their corridors, their courtyards, their transit nodes, the rhythm of light in their local skywells. The fact that these spaces sit inside a structure kilometers thick rarely intrudes on consciousness. Just as ancient villagers did not think daily about the curvature of the earth, citizens of the world city do not think constantly about its totality. Homes are compact, but not cramped. Design prioritizes privacy through sound isolation and spatial layering rather than sheer size. A sense of ownership is maintained not by land, but by continuity, living in the same cluster for decades, watching it evolve subtly as materials age and layouts adapt. Moving between zones is possible, but not encouraged casually. Stability becomes a cultural value, not an imposed rule. Food culture undergoes a quiet revolution. Agriculture is no longer distant or invisible. Vertical farms, fungal protein chambers, aquaculture shafts, and cultured meat facilities are interwoven with residential areas. Children grow up understanding food not as something that arrives, but as something that is maintained. Diets vary by cultural zone, but scarcity largely disappears. Waste becomes a design flaw rather than a tolerated byproduct. Work, too, reshapes itself. With most heavy industry automated and buried deep within the city's infrastructure layers, human labor shifts toward care, education, design, governance, and cultural maintenance. The most valued roles are those that preserve social coherence: mediators, teachers, archivists, systems stewards. Productivity is measured less by output and more by stability. The greatest challenge is psychological, not material. Humans evolved with horizons, seasons, and the possibility of leaving. In the world city, leaving becomes abstract. The outside world exists, but it is distant, protected, and largely uninhabited. Travel beyond the city is rare and ceremonial. Most people will never walk in an unstructured wilderness. Instead, nature is curated, real forests grown inside climate-controlled voids, rivers engineered to wander through open caverns, sky chambers that simulate weather with careful restraint. Surprisingly, this does not produce universal claustrophobia. Studies show that when environments are coherent and predictable, anxiety decreases. What unsettles people is not enclosure, but incoherence. The city, for all its scale, is legible. It makes sense, and in that sense it feels safer than the chaotic sprawl of the old world. Social identity shifts as well. Nationality fades, replaced by zone affiliation. A person is from a place within the city, not from a country on a map. Accents blend, traditions hybridize. Cultural memory stretches vertically rather than geographically. History is preserved not in monuments, but in layers, older districts maintained like living museums that people still inhabit. Conflict does not vanish. It never does. But it changes shape. Disputes are local, cultural, procedural. There are no resource wars because resources are centrally managed and painfully visible. When something breaks, everyone knows where and why. Transparency becomes unavoidable in a closed system. Perhaps the most profound shift is temporal. People grow up knowing the city was built long before them and will outlast them by centuries. This fosters a different relationship with legacy. Fame becomes less important than contribution. Decisions are weighed against how they will affect people who are not yet born but are already planned for in the structure of the city itself. Living inside forever does not feel like stagnation. It feels like inhabiting a long story, one that moves slowly enough for meaning to accumulate. And as life inside the city stabilizes, another question quietly presses forward, one that no amount of engineering can fully resolve. What happens to culture, art, and belief when humanity no longer lives under an open sky? When the last great migrations into the world city taper off, something subtle but profound happens to human culture. For the first time in history, art, belief, and identity are no longer shaped by landscapes that can be left behind. There are no frontiers, no distant shores, no unknown continents to imagine. Humanity's physical world becomes complete, bounded, and fully known. This does not end creativity, but it redirects it inward. Architecture itself becomes one of the dominant art forms. Entire neighborhoods are redesigned over generations as expressions of shared values. Some zones favor openness and light, with wide internal skies and long sightlines. Others deliberately compress space, creating intimacy and enclosure. Moving through the city becomes a cultural experience, a passage through aesthetic philosophies rather than geography. Religion adapts in unexpected ways. Faith traditions that once centered on the heavens, the wilderness, or sacred lands are reinterpreted for a world where nature is curated and the sky is engineered. Some belief systems emphasize stewardship of the city as a moral duty, treating maintenance as a form of worship. Others withdraw into deliberately primitive zones, areas with minimal technological mediation, where darkness, silence, and uncertainty are preserved by design. Art shifts scale. Monumental works no longer point outward toward gods or empires. They point through time. Murals span centuries of construction layers, visible only when sections are renovated. Music evolves to take advantage of cavernous acoustic spaces deep within the city, where sound behaves in ways impossible in open air. Storytelling slows down. Narratives are written to unfold over decades, sometimes centuries, with new chapters added by successive generations. Without a wild exterior to define what civilization is not, culture turns reflective. Questions once asked of nature, who are we? Where do we belong? are now asked of the city itself. The structure becomes a mirror, reflecting collective values back at its inhabitants. Pride and discomfort coexist. People feel protected, but also scrutinized, aware that everything they do contributes to the behavior of the whole. Language begins to shift. Metaphors rooted in oceans, mountains, and distant travel lose relevance. New metaphors emerge from verticality, layering, circulation. People speak of depth instead of distance, of levels instead of borders. To rise or descend within the city carries emotional meaning once associated with journeys across land or sea. Importantly, cultural divergence does not disappear, it intensifies. In a closed system, difference has nowhere to dissipate. Subcultures become deeply textured, highly self-aware. Festivals celebrate not seasons, but milestones in the city's maintenance cycle, the opening of new layers, the sealing of old ones, the rerouting of light. Time is marked by structural change rather than celestial movement. Yet beneath all this innovation lies a quiet unease. Many feel a nostalgia for something they never personally experienced, a sense of exposure, of standing under a sky that did not belong to anyone. This longing becomes a recurring theme in art and philosophy. Not a demand to return to the old world, that is no longer possible, but a meditation on what was traded for safety and continuity. To address this, the city's designers include what they call deliberate absences, vast uninhabited voids where nothing is optimized, no climate control, no curated sound, no programmed lighting beyond safety thresholds. These spaces are uncomfortable by intent. They remind people that not everything must be controlled to be meaningful. Culture in the world's city does not stagnate. It deepens. It grows denser, layered with memory and adaptation. But it also becomes more self-conscious, aware that humanity is now its own environment. And with that awareness comes a final, unsettling realization, one that shifts the conversation from architecture and culture to destiny itself. What happens if the city succeeds too well, and humanity forgets how to live anywhere else? After several generations, the world's city no longer feels like an adaptation. It feels like the default. Children are born into climate-stable corridors, raised under calibrated skies, and taught early that the outside world is something precious, fragile, and mostly off-limits. For them, humanity has always lived inside a structure. The idea that civilization once sprawled across continents sounds less like history and more like mythology. This is where success begins to carry a quiet danger. Physiologically, humans adapt quickly. Studies show subtle shifts in circadian rhythms tuned not to sunrise and sunset, but to the city's light cycles. Vision adjusts to layered depth and indirect light. Hearing becomes more sensitive to enclosed acoustics. These changes are not dramatic, but they accumulate. Humanity does not evolve overnight, but it does acclimate. Psychologically, something deeper happens. Risk perception softens. When structural failure is rare and catastrophe is designed out of daily life, people grow unused to uncertainty. The city absorbs shocks silently, routing around damage before most residents ever notice. Safety becomes invisible, and with invisibility comes complacency. Many citizens can no longer imagine life without mediated stability. The outside world, meanwhile, begins to feel alien. Travel beyond the city is still possible, but fewer people choose it. The open sky feels harsh, disorienting. Weather feels aggressive. Horizons feel empty rather than freeing. Nature, once romanticized, now appears inefficient, beautiful but wasteful. A growing segment of the population begins to see the city not as a shelter, but as an improvement over the planet itself. This mindset alarms long-term planners. The city was never meant to replace Earth. It was meant to give Earth space to heal. If humanity loses its capacity to live outside the city, the entire species becomes dependent on a single system. No matter how resilient that system is, dependency at this scale is a risk no redundancy can fully eliminate. To counter this, deliberate cultural friction is introduced. Education includes periods of external exposure. Young adults spend months or years in restored wilderness zones, maintaining ecosystems with minimal technological support. These experiences are not framed as hardship, but as competence training, proof that humanity can still exist without walls. Architecturally, some zones are designed to feel unfinished, exposed structural elements, variable temperatures, inconsistent lighting. These areas are less comfortable but more instructive. They remind inhabitants that comfort is engineered, not natural, and therefore fragile. There is also a growing philosophical movement that questions the ethics of containment. Critics argue that a civilization that cannot survive outside its own creation is no longer free, no matter how comfortable it is. Others counter that freedom has always been constrained by environment, and the city is simply a better one. The debate never resolves. It becomes one of the city's defining tensions. What is clear is that humanity is changing, not genetically but behaviorally. The skills that once defined survival give way to skills that define maintenance. People become exceptional caretakers of systems, but less experienced with improvisation beyond them. The species grows more careful, more deliberate, and perhaps less wild. Whether this is maturity or loss depends on who you ask. And hovering over all of it is the question no one wants to speak too loudly. If humanity can only survive inside the city, what happens if the city is ever threatened? The greatest fear surrounding the world city is not collapse in the cinematic sense. No sudden implosion, no dramatic crumbling of towers. Engineers are confident they have designed against that. What keeps planners awake is something far quieter: systemic dependence. When all of humanity lives inside one structure, risk no longer spreads. It concentrates. To confront this, the city is designed less like a building and more like a federation of semi-independent worlds. Power is not centralized, but generated across thousands of redundant nodes. Water is recycled locally before entering larger loops. Food systems are modular, capable of isolation if contamination occurs. Entire districts can seal themselves off for months without external support. The city does not trust itself to always function perfectly. It assumes parts of it will fail. Threat modeling becomes a permanent institution, not a department, but a culture. Every generation reevaluates what could go wrong that the previous generation never imagined. Cybernetic failures, social fragmentation, cascading algorithmic decisions, even cultural stagnation are treated as existential risks, alongside earthquakes or meteor strikes. The most dangerous failures are not mechanical, they are conceptual. Governance adapts accordingly. No single authority controls the city. Instead, layered systems of oversight exist, some human, some automated, constantly auditing one another. Transparency is enforced not by morality, but by necessity. In a closed environment, secrecy is instability. Corruption cannot hide for long when its effects echo through shared systems. Still, no amount of redundancy can eliminate vulnerability entirely. A solar disruption severe enough to damage orbital infrastructure. A long-term atmospheric shift affecting energy balances. A slow cultural drift toward apathy that undermines maintenance itself. These are not events with alarms. They are processes that unfold quietly, often invisibly, until response becomes difficult. This awareness shapes collective behavior. Preparedness is not a phase, it is a social norm. Children learn basic systems literacy alongside language and mathematics. Citizens understand how air moves, how water cycles, how energy is stored. Not because they will all become engineers, but because ignorance in a closed system is dangerous. There is also an acceptance, unspoken but real, that the city is not eternal. It is built to last centuries, perhaps millennia, but not forever. This is not a failure of imagination, but an acknowledgement of entropy. The city buys humanity time to stabilize, to heal the planet, to decide what comes next. Some factions argue for building secondary cities as backups, smaller, distributed enclaves on other stable landmasses. Others resist, fearing fragmentation and renewed ecological pressure. The debate mirrors ancient arguments about redundancy versus unity, safety versus cohesion. What unites both sides is a shared understanding. Humanity has placed itself inside a single extraordinary experiment. The city is a triumph of coordination and restraint, but also a gamble taken collectively, knowingly. And as the city matures into a self-aware system, another thought begins to surface, quieter than fear, but heavier with implication. If humanity can design a structure to hold itself, what responsibility does it have for the world it left outside? Long after the world city stops being new, after its construction scars have softened into patina, and its earliest layers feel ancient beneath the feet of people who have never known open sprawl, humanity begins to understand what it has truly built. Not a refuge, not a fortress, but a pause, a deliberate interruption in the long habit of taking more space than it could responsibly hold. The planet outside the city changes in ways no simulation fully predicted. Forests reconnect across continents. Animal migrations return along paths broken for centuries. Rivers settle into new courses without concrete insisting otherwise. The earth does not become untouched, but it becomes less managed. Humanity's footprint shrinks from a smear across the globe to a single, carefully maintained presence. And inside the city, this withdrawal becomes a moral narrative. Children are taught not that humans saved the planet, but that they stepped back. The distinction matters. It frames the city not as a triumph over nature, but as an admission of limits. Civilization did not win. It learned restraint. Over time, the city's role shifts from necessity to stewardship. Its systems are no longer focused solely on sustaining life, but on observing, studying, and quietly repairing the biosphere beyond its walls. Entire cultural institutions are devoted to watching the planet recover, not intervening unless absolutely necessary. The world becomes something humanity protects by not occupying it. This restraint reshapes ethics. Progress is no longer measured by growth, but by stability. Innovation is judged by whether it reduces complexity rather than increases it. The most admired achievements are invisible ones. Systems that quietly work for centuries without demanding attention. The idea of leaving the city, truly leaving it, to resettle the planet, never fully disappears. Some see the city as a cocoon, meant to be outgrown. Others believe it is the final form of responsible civilization. The argument never resolves, because it cannot. Each generation inherits the decision anew. What is different now is that humanity has given itself time to argue thoughtfully. From orbit, the world city is visible but restrained. Not a glittering scar, but a dense, luminous knot against the dark interior of a continent. Around it, the earth breathes. Clouds move without interruption. Night skies grow darker again. Silence returns to places that forgot it existed. In this future, Historians will not mark the construction of the city as the moment humanity reached its peak. They will mark it as the moment humanity stopped assuming it deserved everything the planet could offer. The city does not claim to be perfect. It does not promise eternity. What it offers instead is something far rarer in the history of civilizations: